I want to turn to the agreement for just a moment here and go over its major provisions. You've all been provided a copy of the agreement. If you have questions, please ask as I go through here. Feel free to stop me. The general requirements are a two-party agreement that's going to last for a term of 3 years. And EPA commits during that 3-year term that if the city fulfills the specific obligations of the agreement, EPA is not going to list the city on the EPLS. That's the basic tenet that we're after there. In return, again, the city's got to comply with all federal, state, and local laws and the provisions of our plea agreement. The good news is we believe we've already fulfilled all provisions of the plea agreement, and I'll get to EPA's attention to that issue. I believe EPA is also in agreement that we have fulfilled all of those provisions. The other substantive requirement from a contracting issue that usually is not included in a compliance agreement is that the city must remain committed to retaining Operations Management International, OMI, our contract utility operator. We must maintain OMI during the term of the agreement, and we've worked with staff and utilities folks, and that is certainly in the city's best interest, and now it will be a requirement of the agreement. Secondly, and this is somewhat of a standard compliance agreement provision that they use with corporate America, and it's a little novel when applying it to municipality, but again, Mr. Black has done a great job with it. The city is required to prepare an ethics and code of conduct policy, the new policy that you'll hear referred to, and that will ultimately, I believe, be brought back before council for review and adoption. The policy has to include at a minimum a statement of the city's commitment to comply with all federal environmental laws and regulations, a new policy for ethical guidelines for city employees to follow, a description of the federal fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, which is an existing government hotline, whereby employees could report violations of law or any violations of the compliance agreement, and a notice from the city that appropriate disciplinary action will be taken against any officials, any managers, any employees who violate environmental laws or violate the new policy that will ultimately be adopted by the city. And also, city employees of the utilities department must be trained on compliance and ethics, and then we're required to certify that back to EPA that training has occurred. Next, within 60 days of the effective date of the agreement, the city must appoint an ethics compliance officer, and that officer is going to be charged with the duty to receive and investigate all allegations of noncompliance under the policy, environmental laws, and serve as the point of contact, a non-accusatory, a non-punitive contact where people can come and voice complaints and voice concerns. Mr. Black has gratefully volunteered to serve as the city's first ethics compliance officer.
I didn't take that way from the EPA folks.
And
we're glad to serve.
If the city does approve the compliance agreement today, we are also going to ask council during this session to also approve Mr. Black as a new compliance officer, because that is a commitment we have made to EPA that we will expedite that appointment. Although we have 60 days to do it from execution of the agreement, we've committed to EPA that we would expedite that process, and we want to be able to report to them by the end of this month that we have a compliance officer in place. Next is insurance that the utilities department employees receive at least 1 hour of annual training on ethics and the requirements of the policy. This includes an annual review and update of the policy and incorporation of new ethical standards that EPA recommends. Again, there's some reporting and certification requirements to EPA about utilities department employees that have been trained in this. And I believe ultimately Mr. Black will recommend to you, and the city should seriously consider expanding this certification and training program to all city employees and not just employees of the utilities department. A couple other requirements real quickly are additional certifications. Certifications that all employees who will be entering their signature and their verifications in the city logbooks, that they be trained and updated annually on the compliance and ethics policy. Discharge monitoring reports are going to have to comply with new Venice standard operating procedures for verifying accuracy and completeness. This is a requirement of the compliance agreement, It's one of the requirements that Mr. Black and his staff have already fulfilled. It was a policy that we were able to take to EPA, present to them, and they were very favorably impressed that we had proactively implemented that last year before this issue even came up. That policy will be attached to the agreement and as an exhibit thereto for enforcement purposes. Finally, there's a reporting obligation to EPA in the event that the city is accused of any civil or criminal environmental violations. We would have an affirmative reporting obligation similar to some of the obligations that we have under the existing plea agreement. And finally, there is an on-site compliance review program that is already established by EPA. This is not a new program. It's not something that is unique to this compliance agreement. All entities that I've ever seen enter into a compliance agreement with EPA, they are subject to, during that 3-year term of the agreement, inspections from EPA. And based upon our discussions with the investigator from EPA in Atlanta, I think Mr. Black can expect a visit during the winter months from the EPA investigator that he certainly intends to come down and follow up on that obligation. So that's something that will happen possibly just once in 3 years, but certainly no more frequently than annually, unless we were to have, you know, some serious problems or concerns arise under the agreement. One change to the agreement, council members, is the signature page. Earlier this week, we were provided with an updated signature page from EPA, along with a time demand from EPA. Not that the city has delayed this or drug its feet at all, but EPC staff in Atlanta has simply received some pressure from their supervisors to get this wrapped up because the plea agreement was signed, you know, some time ago. So I have a new signature page that I would like to distribute to council. You'll note that there are some substantive differences in the debarring official's endorsement at the bottom of the signature page, and quite frankly, I think these are very positive changes. I think these changes will be a substantial benefit to the city in that the debarring official who has to approve this agreement has now made an affirmative finding that his signature and his approval, and this is a quote, constitutes certification that the conditions giving rise to the violations have been corrected. So we were, quite frankly, very pleasantly surprised and pleased to receive this new signature page. I do want to note that if council elects to approve the agreement today, that we will have it signed by Mr. Black on behalf of the city and transmit it to Atlanta. It is not effective, though, until it is signed by the debarring official. So we essentially have an agreement, we have a negotiated settlement with the United States, but it is not finalized until such time as it is executed by the debarring official. And I will give you a heads up that the debarring official takes a critical look at these agreements. The debarring official is in Washington, D.C. and has not been party to the day-in, day-out negotiations and provisions of this agreement, and there are times that the debarring official will come back and say, you know what, 90 days is not a sufficient time frame. We want this done in 60 days. We think we have a final settlement with these folks, but if there are any changes, we will certainly bring that back to you promptly. EPA is anxious to have this issue resolved and get the compliance agreement signed, though.